Welcome.
Hi, good evening. It looks like we've got all of our people from the waiting room into the main room. So I think we can now begin.
Well,
Uh,
let's wait until we're live.
oh, right. Forgot about the other.
Cecily will.
Yeah.
Okay.
Are we good? Okay. So good evening, everybody, and welcome to the fourth and regrettably last event, but certainly not the least event in our series of talks that we're calling Exploratory Translation. I'm Hans Saucy, and I have a great deal of introducing to do tonight. Tonight's talk by Professor John Keane of Rutgers University, New York, is called Napoleon Rivers, Black Studies and Translation as Anti-Racist Activism. So you've come to the right place. I'm about to introduce my colleague, Jennifer Scapitone, and I will do that. But first, let me acknowledge the sponsors for this series, namely the Franke Center for the Humanities, the Master of Arts program in the Humanities, the Center for East Asian Studies, the English Department, the Experimental Performance Committee, Creative Writing, Comparative Literature, and Translation Studies at the University of Chicago, all of which have been very generous in helping and permitting us to do this series of events. We're very grateful to them. We're grateful to Cecily Chen, who has managed a great deal of things behind the scenes and is doing so even as I speak. Jennifer Scapitone, who will be moderating tonight's event, is professor in the departments of English and Romance Languages and Literatures. She's also active, highly active, in the creative writing concentration at the University of Chicago. I will be brief and just mention the last three full-length books that she's published in different genres. There's Locomotrix, a translation and study of Emilia Rosselli. There is Killing the Moonlight, a study of futurist poetics and poetry, and The Republic of Exit 43, outtakes and scores from an archaeology and pop-up opera of the corporate dump, which is a work of poetry and of intensive bricolage. She's currently finishing a book manuscript called Poetry After Barbarism, Fascism, the Abracadabrant Word, and the Invention of a Motherless Tongue. It is a pleasure and an honor to introduce her tonight, as she then performs the function of moderating Professor John Keane's talk. Jennifer.
Thank you all for coming. John Keane is a writer and thinker of unflinchingly beheld, lushly articulated depths, and such fulsome and unapologetic breadth of hemispheric and transoceanic scope that the task of introducing him is bound to fall short, to gloss over essentials, to feel like patchwork of the sort that Henry James saw in his late attempts at representation, obliged to impart to patches the value of presences. Still, I'm going to try, but in accordance with our promise to ourselves in this semi-independent series not to reproduce the Chicago tradition of the epic introduction, I'm going to focus my remarks on one aspect of John's work rather than being Catholic about the matter, the fact that he is a translator, and the way that the patient and often inconspicuous work of getting to know the world in its manifold rhythms, phonologies, lexicons, and syntax comes through in his own writing. In a widely circulated and discussed 2016 paper on translating poetry, translating Blackness, John details an intense and fearlessly independent trajectory of studying language as much more than a channel of expression, as what he calls a medium, a field, a tool, a site of being. This rigorous study formed a literal tether to authors from all over the globe, eclipsed from the literary conversation, which is to say, in particular, poets, women, LGBTQ authors, and authors of African descent. Though he studied Latin, Greek, French, and German in high school, John Keene emphasizes the role of autodidaxy in his linguistic education as a way of filling in blind spots in the Eurocentric educational system. He recalls picking up a copy of Teach Yourself Sanskrit from a library in sixth grade and deciding that this book was meant for him. Autodidaxy and a passionate interest in Brazilian culture also led him to study Portuguese prior to Spanish and additional Romance languages. This is the backdrop against which he could confront the baroquely poetic, philosophical, hyper-literary, brilliant pornography of a writer of controversy like Ilda Ilst, Brazil's Marquis de Sade, as John puts it, whose Letters from a Seducer he translated for Nightboat Books and the Rio-based Abolya in a joint publishing venture in 2014. Ilst's queer, libertine epistolary fiction, or play, was composed against the backdrop of a recently lifted military dictatorship and the violent homophobia and transphobia that aggravated response to the AIDS epidemic. So its obscenity is highly politicized, while serving as Ilst's polemical rejoinder to the literary marketplace, and as a pleasurable end in itself. Every translator knows what a nightmare it is to convey the vernacular in a way that doesn't degrade, parody, or embalm the original. When the vernacular is addressed to the sexed body, the challenge is multiplied sevenfold. Yet Ilst's restlessly inventive lexicon of the obscene is brilliantly transmitted by Keene in ways that retain the shockingly sweet poetics of the original. And the knots were tightened, the entanglement more octopus. I finally figured out our library's emergency access policy this afternoon and was able to read the Portuguese, but decided that it was quite difficult to quote in public. Suffice it to say that John's rendering upholds its quality of being animal, vegetable, mineral, and culinarily citational. Letters from a Seducer opens with a protagonist who collects food and garbage from the dregs of an exploded church and from the classy people he addresses in the second person in a burlap sack. Stones, rats, excrement, reliquary bric-a-brac of 8 centuries of Catholic colonization, melted plastic, and books like The Death of Ivan Illich and Das Kapital that he washes for the reading. The polyvocal burlap bag becomes a useful carrier for what Keene, in his introduction to Ilst's The Obscene Madame D, brought into English by Nathanael and Raquel Araújo, calls its central principle: unmaking as a path to self-making, dereliction as the compass to navigating what looks at first unnavigable. This vivid hoard of artifacts in a sack, civilization's garbage, heaping up and finally expulsed by the novelistic sea, feels like a demotic underbelly to the sweep of artifacts of civilization that Keene hacks into in his most recent published collection, The Exquisite Counter-Narratives: Colonial Map, Favela Tabloid, Ads for the Fugitive Enslaved, lists of commodities stolen and items to be packed on behalf of the fleeing overlords of Hispaniola, penal codes, a history of Roman Catholics in the early American Republic, all becoming fodder for critical fabulation in Saidiya Hartman's formulation. Keene takes in the legacy of colonization and of the slave trade as registered in a range of imposed tongues, then counter-composes from its wholes, or annotates, assuming a wide range of registers in a wide range of genres. These tales are asterisks laden with supplements to the history book's narrow running margin, channeling history's rhetoric against itself to animate the lives of African-descended peoples having prevailed against the predations of displacement, of cultural and literal genocide. Dense textures of encounter with these historically situated labyrinths and languages of the Black diaspora that are the hallmark of Keene's decades of study, schooled and renegade, make counter-narratives and unparalleled interrogation by occupation of the grammar of violence in all the idioms that infiltrate these pages, the passive voice and the circumlocution of rape, torture, dispossession, tokenism, and murder, but not only. Keen's prose is also a study in the occulted idiolects of survival, in the form of the shibboleth, spiritual exegesis, symbolic trace, spell, curse, pantomime, charcoal prophecy, black vaudeville, literary blues, and anthropophagic manifesto. In the diary of his character Carmel, a speechless yet oracular Haitian girl pressed into the service of an overweening master's daughter in a convent near Hurtstown, Kentucky, we become witness to a girl's process of achieving literacy in the four languages of her survival, the swirl of the convent's French and Latin meeting the English of the townspeople who view the place as a popish cult, and ultimately, in the first person achieved by the story's closure, the Creole of her healer mother. I checked in with our dear mutual comrade, Nathanael, for a translation of the Creole line, but it was upon learning its meaning that I realized it would be best kept secret rather than facilely translated to the public, retained for those who either speak Creole or make the intimate effort to understand it. On a personal level, I cherish the fact that John should be the final speaker in the second series devoted to translation that I've curated in my time at the University of Chicago, given that he was the colleague who attended the first back in 2009, schlepping down from Northwestern to hear about Poesia Ultima, or Italian poetry now, when translation studies on campus was but the glimmer in a handful of eyes, and the time spent as a new professor passing the bucket for such endeavors deemed a potential hazard. John wrote about the events on his polymathic blog, Jay's Theater, ended up translating the Sicilian poet Maria Attanasio years later, and showed up all over town and even at a garbage dump for performances armed with good faith, camera, and a documentarist's attention. That curiosity, devotion, and generation of engagement struck me uniquely and kept me going in a new place. This example of radical porosity against the common skepticism regarding which proficiencies are the ones worthy of one's time and action becomes the basis for an ethics not only of translation, but of acting at large that makes John one of a cherished few in my pantheon of great artist intellectuals. John Keene was born and raised in St. Louis. He's authored and co-authored books across a range of genres. Stay tuned for the forthcoming collection, Punks. His many honors include a 2018 Wyndham Campbell Prize and a 2018 MacArthur Foundation Fellowship. He chairs the Department of African American and African Studies, is Distinguished Professor of English and African American Studies, and also teaches in the Creative Writing Program at Rutgers University, Newark. Please help me welcome him with emoticons, chat messages, and raving hands.
Oh my God, what a beautiful introduction, Jennifer. I mean, I can't thank you enough for that. And I just want to say, sometimes, you wake up and you kind of look at the day and you think, what am I going to do today? And you see something happening and you ask yourself, should I go to this? Or should I do this? And you say, maybe I shouldn't do it. Then you say, maybe I don't. You have a debate and then you decide to do it, which I did when, as Jennifer mentioned, she hosted the Poesia Ultima event in Chicago. And as a result of that, I have made extraordinary friendships with people both here and in Italy. And as a result of that, I think it was in 2017 during the G7 summit, one of the poets who's there, who's an extraordinary business person as well, who also now spends a lot of time here, invited me, and I met all these poets from Europe and other parts of the globe. But we had the unique experience experience of walking up through the birch forest on Mount Etna, which is of course now exploding. So as a result of, yes, being a fan of your work and wanting to hear the new poetry from Italy and to just be in dialogue, I had that extraordinary experience and so many others. So thank you so much. And I see so many amazing people here who are here to talk. So thank you so much for being here. I mean, I could go down the list. This is a really extraordinary gathering. So thank you so much for being here. So in addition to thanking Jennifer, I also want to thank Hans Saucy, Cecily Chen, and all the centers and programs at the University of Chicago for the opportunity to present these thoughts. I also want to say that since we're Zooming, if any listeners have heard prior versions of this talk, which I continue to reflect on and puzzle through, my apologies. And I'm going to mention one of them in a minute, who did hear an earlier version of this. I want to extend a special thanks to the graduate students and faculty in the Department of Modern Languages and Literatures at the University of Miami, where I first presented this talk, of early version of this talk that was quite different. It was, one half was really kind of scholarly, and the other half was much more kind of lyrical and poetic. And I also want to thank Susan Bernofsky, who I see is here, because it was her invitation to speak at Columbia University as part of their translation program that sort of pushed me to go a little bit more in the scholarly direction. So I want to thank you as well, Susan, and thanks for being here. And before I begin, I would be remiss in not thanking another person who I see here, who is the reason I wrote this talk. Fellow writer, translator, poet, critic, and University of Texas El Paso professor, Rosa Alcala. She said, you don't have to thank me, but I want to thank you because right before a discussion on translation at the Haystack Book Talks Festival, I think it was Haystack Book Festival, a few years ago, she mentioned Napoleon Rivers to me. And just in this very kind of low-key way, I'd never heard of Napoleon Rivers. And she said, you should check out, this essay that he wrote. And I think, she recognized that I was was actually following in his tradition. And so I'm really glad that she suggested that. I'm incredibly grateful. And I've been thinking with him and through what he wrote since that time. And so this talk is sort of based on that. And I also want to say that, above all, please check out her work, her poetry criticism and translations of a number of writers, including the really extraordinary Cecilia Vicuña. So let me begin the talk now. On November 1st, 1933, a 35-year-old professor of Romance languages and literatures at the historically Black Agricultural and Technical College, now North Carolina A&T, in Greensboro, North Carolina, delivered a paper entitled Why Negroes Should Study Romance Languages and Literatures. Napoleon Rivers was speaking at the annual gathering of the Association for the Study of Negro Life and History in Washington, D.C., an organization founded by Carter G. Woodson, best known today as the founder of Negro History Week, which eventually became what we now celebrate and just officially concluded as Black History Month. Like Woodson, who was 13 years his senior and in whose orbit he would soon regularly move, Rivers was born in the post-bellum, post-Reconstruction South, in his case in Mobile, Alabama. After attending Talladega College for his BA, he, like Woodson, had attended the University of Chicago for part of his graduate education, receiving an MA in Romance Languages and Literatures, and like Woodson, had attended an Ivy League university for his PhD. In Woodson's case, it was Harvard. In Rivers' case, it was Cornell. And I just want to note that, University of Chicago stands out as one of the schools where African Americans could actually receive graduate training. Not a lot, but it was unlike almost every university in the South and many universities in the North. It did allow a small number of African Americans to study at the graduate level. Moreover, like Woodson and nearly everyone else associated with the Association for the Study for Negro Life and History, which continues to this day as the Association for the Study of African American Life and History, and ASNLH ALH does still exist. So you can find them online. They always have amazing events and talks and things happening. You can find them on Twitter, I think, right away. So ASALH. Rivers' concerns, even a cursory review of his essay he delivered would underscore, were not merely pedagogical, but profoundly political and cultural. Education was, for Woodson, Rivers, and many others in the milieu, not merely about the disinterested search for knowledge and transmission of ideas and information, but race work, anti-racist work, recuperative, reparative, rehabilitative, proactive. Knowledge was and had to be more than a thing in itself. And in the ongoing struggle for freedom and equality, African Americans and, as Rivers and others viewed the challenges at hand, Black people throughout the hemisphere and the diaspora. And I want to stress that because they were, of course, on the one hand, thinking very, very, directly about the experiences of African Americans, but they were also thinking about Black people in the broader sense, Black people across the globe and the struggle for freedom. The struggles for freedom, could not advance without the crucial tools of facts, data, and a deeper sense of the historical, social, political, economic, and cultural archive about themselves, in part to counter the waves of racist and white supremacist propaganda and discourse seeded in all aspects of American life, from popular culture to academia, that buffeted Black people on a daily basis. In essence, this prefigured one of the central currents of what we now know as Black studies, Africana studies, and African American studies broadly understood. So they are, even though we think of Black studies as coming quite directly out of the student activism and of the late 60s, early 70s, and the civil rights movement and Black power movements, of course, of the 40s through, and Black power, of course, the late 60s movements, right? These were the kind of engines, right? You have this earlier kind of seed, a set of seeds being planted by figures like Carter Woodson, Napoleon Rivers, etc. Moreover, Rivers believed that the archive extended beyond the borders of the United States, which is to say beyond the English language barrier. For him and others like Woodson, American education had actively harmed African Americans and indoctrinated white people and everyone else by incorrectly teaching that Blacks in the US not only had suffered from a severing of all ties with Africa, but that they were a people without any history worthy of note and dehumanized beyond repair by the chattel slave system. In addition, they had been taught that they were also isolated from other Black people across the globe, including in Europe and the Americas, and that those other Black people's experiences, however much they seemed to parallel those of African Americans, were in key ways fundamentally incommensurate. So not just different, but incommensurate. His talk and life's work aimed to counter this, and in so doing drew upon a series of prior thinkers going back to Kwabena Otobo Cugoano and the Sons of Africa in the 1790s in London, and Edward Wilmot Blyden in the US and Sierra Leone in the last quarter of the 19th century. By the turn of the 20th century, Pan-Africanism and the related idea of the diaspora had begun to animate a number of major thinkers across the globe who met in 1900 at the first Pan-African Conference in London. As is well known, the conference's chief organizer was a Trinidadian, Henry Sylvester Williams, and drew 37 participants and 10 observers from the continent of Africa, the Caribbean, the United Kingdom, and the United States. Among the best known was W.E.B. Du Bois, then a young professor at Atlanta University, but among its other notable participants were American author and sociologist and Black American radical activist Anna Julia Cooper, Antonio Famin, the Haitian anthropologist, author, and government minister, and Dadabai Naoraji, the Parsi intellectual, teacher, businessman, and British MP, suggesting that among the organizers and participants, belief in who could speak to and about the concept of Africanness and Blackness was more expansive than we might even imagine today, and that it was also inextricably linked to anti-colonialism and decolonization, as well as anti-imperialism and anti-racism. By the time that Rivers delivered his talk in 1933, some 3 decades later, during what David Levering Lewis has identified as the final period of the Harlem Renaissance, and in the wake of a series of Pan-African conferences before and after the First World War, Pan-Africanism and diasporicism had long watered the soil of certain sectors of Black thought in America and beyond, ranging from Marcus Garvey's United Negro Improvement Association to the writers who would convene under the banner Negritude. Rivers was thus not alone in his view that adopting a broader scope for understanding the Black world and Black people was key. To that end, he opened his paper first by emphasizing the value of knowing two languages. And this is very interesting. He stressed two languages, of course, one of them being English, but of course, as well, another language, as very, very likely English, but another language as well, which he stated an ancient Persian proverb prescribed as having two souls before citing Napoleon Bonaparte's dictum to his soldiers to learn the language of the conquered, doubling their combat value, and Goethe's famous apothegm that a poet that knew no other language than their own could not understand their own, which is a really sort of profound statement. By the second paragraph, however, Rivers had shifted to the main focus of his talk, which was that the Negro could find practical reasons to make a special case for himself with respect to Romance languages and literatures. And I should note here that Rivers' focus on Western European languages may seem narrow to us today, but I see it as arising out of the particularities of his training, the prestige of these languages in American academia and cultural life at that time, if not perhaps as much today. Though, of course, I think it's probably fair to say that the Romance languages have still hold tremendous esteem in American Academy, and particularly certain ones over as opposed to others. And the accessibility during that era of the archives in these languages, especially with regard to Black figures and subject matter, compared to those of other non-classical European languages and literatures, as well as non-European languages, including the indigenous Creole and Pidgin languages of Africa, Asia, and the Americas. The practical reasons he gives are worth quoting in full and provide the schema he will expound upon throughout the rest of the essay. Briefly, the Negro should study the Romance languages and literatures. And this is his quote. The Negro should study the Romance languages and literatures in order to, one, increase his knowledge of the history and literature of his race. Two, to combat falsehood with truth by searching the sources in these languages and bringing to light important facts which have been obscured, falsified, or omitted, and to rehabilitate distinguished personages of African descent who have contributed richly to world culture but have been detracted or omitted in books printed in the English language. Three, to compete more effectively for additional economic opportunities at home and abroad. And four, to open up for himself a newer and larger world of ideas. It's very, very interesting what he's sort of suggesting. Of course, there's that practical component, which I'll talk about in a minute. So, studying Romance languages and literatures, which is to say learning to read, write, speak, and translate from and into those languages, would aid African Americans not only in the practical ways Rivers identified for listeners, for advanced work in humanistic, scientific, or professional study in fields, to improve their grasp of English, and to increase, as Rivers says, the capital stock of one's culture. More importantly for him, and he hoped his audience, was to grasp that knowing and having facility in these languages would open up a richer vista onto a Black past, and presumably a Black present that lay hidden, often overtly concealed, because a lack of access to a body of knowledge beyond the limits of English, while also arming Black people with the, quote, truth of, quote, facts to counter the steady tide of anti-Black racist disinformation and misinformation and historical and cultural illusion propagated not only in American mass culture, but in all aspects of US society, including academia. He emphasized knowledge of a Romance language as yet another potentially beneficial economic tool at hand. And Rivers, writing during the Great Depression, was clear here and everywhere else in the paper about the need for practicality, expanded linguistic facility in this most basic sense. And he ended by arguing that these language skills would allow African Americans to engage with a, quote, newer and larger, unquote, world of ideas not delimited by and to the Anglosphere, which is to say a larger Black intellectual world that was very likely not going to be of interest to anti-Black racists who control the US levers of power and access. And I think that's probably still true today. I mean, there's only so much interest in what's happening outside the US by the people in power. As a result of the distorted, often grotesque image of African Americans that had been cultivated and which had taken root across American society, Rivers argued, Black people in the US had almost no knowledge of their history and civilization, and this critical lack was particularly harmful given the systemic and structural forms of racism, in part designed based on racist and white supremacist ideas and foundations that they faced on a daily basis. Here he mirrored the arguments not only of Carter G. Woodson and Du Bois in their writings, but autodidactic figures like J.A. Rogers, whose books, and these are some of the titles of his books, From Superman to Men, Nature Knows No Color Line, World's Great Men of Color, the multi-volume Sex and Race, and quote, Five Negro Presidents, that's my favorite, right? Attempted a form of intellectual, critical, and theoretical redress. Yet for the scholar and researcher Rivers, careful exploration of the non-Anglophone archive offered a special key, not least because of the long history of contact going back to the post-Hellenic and Roman eras between Europeans along the Mediterranean basin and Africa, which lay just across the water. In fact, as he went on to note, going language by language, and country by country, first in Europe and then in Africa and the Americas, not only were the histories of the regions in which the Romance languages developed and flourished marked by the significant African presence and the extensive interaction that followed, but by an array of figures he enumerated, some well known and others less so, including people not identified by Rogers and others, who were known and being named as people of African descent in those languages and histories, and thus legible as Black in an archive to which those who did not speak or read those languages, which is to say most African Americans, had little to no access. Indeed, in the talk, he even cites some of these sources, such as when discussing the Africans who, quote, who fought, quote, as officers and common soldiers, unquote, under, quote, Spanish arms in the revolt of the Netherlands, unquote. He cites the Spanish Golden Age playwright Andrés de Claramonte, whose drama on a particularly notable warrior was titled El Valiente Negro in Flandres. Prefacing this snippet of history, Rivers pointed out that such a fact, quote, is not stressed in the usual histories of Spain written in English, which is to say they have been omitted, elided, or outright erased. What I want to note is that Rivers is arguing not only that people of African descent have a far richer history and, quote, civilization, unquote, than they, we, and everyone else were ever taught or not, an issue relevant not only for his moment, but still today, as we see with the widespread ignorance around American anti-Black race riots, right? There's a long history of anti-Black race riots, or blackface minstrelsy. We just had a little eruption in New Jersey with blackface minstrelsy, or racist medical experimentation, which of course, and abuse, which has been in the news as we talk about the COVID-19 pandemic and the vaccine, or sundown towns, right, which was kind of a recurrent feature in the very popular show last year, Lovecraft Country, to take just a few. But heretically for white supremacists, that Black people also played key roles in civilizing, right, this problematic word, Romance-speaking Europe, or were important agents during central moments in Europe's history of civilization. And one could also quite easily argue that not only were African Americans in 1933 unaware of this history, but that a good deal of Europeans in those very nations and regions, as well as white Americans today, remain unaware of the complex truth of this past, as a racist incident at the Classical Studies Conference several years ago, and imbroglios about new scholarship and medieval studies underscore. So this is kind of recurrent theme that continues to happen, continues to play out. Rivers here calls out not only white American scholars of Romance languages and literatures, but also white translators who, not unlike certain historians of American history, he notes, produce, and these are his words, quote, a flow of lies in the form of English translations, lectures, interpretations, and appraisals on all matters concerning foreign Negroes, adding that, quote, they belittle the Negro by omission, misinterpretation, or downright falsification. To put it another way, in their effort to brainwash and gaslight Black Americans and everyone else to buy into supposed Black racial inferiority, Rivers argues that white scholars, critics, and translators have also actively participated in the miseducation of Black people in the US through miseducation about and misrepresentation of Black people outside the US. It's very interesting. Erasure, silencing, negation. He will have none of it. Rivers goes on to explicitly name some of these scholars, beginning with his American former University of Chicago professor H. Carrington Lancaster, whose dismissive estimation of Alexandre Dumas Père and Alexandre Dumas Fils, two of the leading lights of 19th century French letters, he contrasts with a white French scholar, Albert Chinard, who offers a diametrically opposed assessment. Though an intrepid researcher perhaps might find a French scholar from that era, or even today with a less positive reading, informed in part by racism and of course also by aesthetic values of the value and talent of the Dumas duo. Rivers' ultimate point about Lancaster and the host of other scholars, critics, journalists, and translators he cites anonymously or calls out by name is that being Black and able to read these writers and the other historical and cultural figures he invokes, being able to pour through contemporaneous accounts, criticism, biographical material, literature, ephemera, and so forth about them in the original and not mediated by a white racist anglophone filter is crucial, and it is a skill he is urging his peers at the Association for Research in the Study of Negro Life to cultivate among themselves and the students they train and encounter. In other words, Rivers is stressing that possessing the ability to translate work from these languages is, in essence, anti-racist practice. Translation, like scholarship in these languages, marks a form of empowering and invaluable race work to and for him, and for Black Americans more generally, establishing in C.L.R. James' term a kinship, quote, beyond the boundary, unquote. It is no surprise then that 2 years later, and by then head of the Department of Romance Languages and Literatures at the Minor Teachers College, later to become the University of the District of Columbia, he wrote to W.E. Du Bois offering his services in drafting articles on, quote, persons of the Negro race who have left their imprint in French, Spanish, Italian, and German literatures and histories within the following geographical reaches: the continent, Central and South America, and the islands of the Caribbean, based in part, I surmise, on original and archival research for Du Bois's Encyclopedia of the Negro. And let me see if I can pull this up here. You can see the letter. Yes, this is fascinating. Now, my aim is not to recapitulate Rivers's entire essay, which digresses into other areas not of immediate concern for my purposes here. I also want to note that in as much as Rivers is offering a powerful anti-racist critique about US practices, he at times can be a bit blinkered about racism overseas, trafficking in a romantic naivete about color blindness and the absence of racism in non-US societies, and at times reinscribes a heroic or great Black man of history discourse. Though I acknowledge the era in which he was writing and his experiences as an African American who moved through European societies as a soldier during World War II. Instead, I want to sit with the essay's final movement before I shift to the second and shorter portion of this talk. In it, Rivers champions the, quote, new world of ideas that Black readers of Romance languages will find in works by Black writers in those languages to which they had previously no direct access. This is interesting. He counsels against servilely imitating these non-US, non-English models, yet also suggests that, quote, there prevails an atmosphere, as well as numerous aesthetic possibilities and elements, quote, which encourages creativeness that is scarcely available for him in the literature, culture, and arts of his oppressor. In other words, rather than wrestling with the aesthetic templates handed down by white predecessors and peers, which at this moment in time would have included the entire corpus of the English and British, of course, literary tradition and nearly 300 years of US literature, and from which Black writers and writing in the past and in the present day had been ignored, excluded, fetishized, or marginalized. Rivers is actively advocating an artistic and intellectual dialogue with Black writers from sectors of the diaspora, the segment he knows best, and in which he can imagine new forms emerging, not shaped or warped by the oppressive, conventional, and approved models and forms usually bequeathed to African Americans. And one could add or counter that many of Rivers' contemporaries among the Harlem Renaissance writers had already begun to choose an alternative path. And in their case, for many of them, Black vernacular, proletariat, and folk culture suffused, as we know now, with an array of Africanisms and carryovers. One thing I find telling is that in the essay, Rivers identifies a number of notable writers he urges his listeners to explore, and in one case, retranslate in order to rectify the absence of their voices in English, as well as the bowdlerized versions that in a few cases did exist. Yet looking back some 86, and now, of course, even a few years later, almost 90 years, It is very likely the case that many of these figures, including the Haitian novelist Frédéric Marcelin, the 19th century Cuban poets Ambrosio Echemendia and Francisco Diaz Rivera, and the 20th century figures Regino Pedroso, Regino Botti, and Gerardo Jimenez, and the Martinican writer René Marin, the first person to win France's prestigious Goncourt Prize for his novel Batuala, were not translated then, nor have they been since. And this is also fascinating because in the case of Bodie and Jimenez, they even received a second boost in 1933 from Arturo A. Schomburg, founder of what became the world famous Schomburg Library for Research in Black Culture, in his contemporary opportunity essay, My Trip to Cuba in Quest of Negro Books. So, of course, Schomburg was going to Cuba to look for books in Spanish by contemporary Afro-Cuban writers, and he singles out these two writers and says, please, translate them, if you can. And as it turns out, this really did not happen. For Marin, translation of his prize-winning novel into English occurred in 1921, but as Rivers notes, the author, quote, expressed bitterness and embarrassment over the mutilation of his prize-winning novel by the inept and stupid American translation done by an American white. To this roster, one could now add thousands more writers, still waiting to be translated at even 1/100th of the rate of their non-Black peers. Rather ironically, the one Black American poet of that era who actively took up Rivers' charge to read, speak, and translate in Romance languages was Langston Hughes, the very poet whose translations comprised, to Rivers' eye, and this is fascinating, this is what he said of Hughes's translations. They consisted really of, quote, only quatrains and sophisticated light verses. So we all have critical blind spots. Hughes would go on to take up Rivers' call more than any other major Black American poet of his generation or subsequent ones, translating more demanding work by Cuban poet Nicolas Guillen and the Haitian author Jacques Romain, as well as poetry by Spaniard Federico Garcia Lorca and Chilean Gabriela Mistral. And of course, the other interesting thing about both Lorca and Mistral is they're two queer poets in the Spanish language that he also brings, that Hughes helps to bring into English. Napoleon Rivers passed away at the age of 82 in 1980. His work, or rather the call he extended in 1933, I want to suggest, remains unfulfilled. If there ever were a time, as I argued a few years ago in translating poetry, translating Blackness, for individual translators to respond, and I would, of course, stress tonight, Black studies in particular, to take up the task, it is now. Rivers' goal as a scholar, Jafari Sinclair Allen, beautifully summed it up to me in response to hearing an early version of this paper, was revindication of Black people, or to put it in other words, vindication and valorization outside the American societal context, then and now, of racism and white supremacy. Anti-racist revindication was supremely necessary at a moment in which Black people of African descent were facing extreme social, political, and economic challenges at home and abroad, and at a time when fascism, evident in the rise of Benito Mussolini, who launched a war against Ethiopia, Adolf Hitler, who took power in Germany in 1933, and others of their ilk were gaining power and control. And of course, we could also add Francisco Franco a few years later. This was the era of the Great Depression, which devastated African Americans across the US, the Scottsboro Boys Trial, 1931, and the Tuskegee Syphilis Study, 1932, among other notable events. It was also a time of rising Black activism and engagement, we should never forget, and that included the literary and cultural flowering that constituted the Harlem Renaissance. Considerable labor struggle involving African American unions, such as the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters and Maids, and the establishment of the Southern Tenant Farmers Union, Murray versus Pearson, argued by Thurgood Marshall and Charles Hamilton Houston of the NAACP, to open admission to the University of Maryland Law School, which provided a foundation for Brown versus Board of Education a decade and a half later. One of the very first sit-ins, which occurred in Alexandria, Virginia, the establishment of the Southern Negro Youth Congress, as well as the founding of the Nation of Islam. So this was a moment of extraordinary ferment. I mean, I think it's easy to forget, we kind of focus on one thing or another thing. You see just all of the kind of cultural, political, social activism that's happening at that moment. It's really quite extraordinary. While we might take a more nuanced view of Rivers' approach today, setting his desire for vindication aside in favor of other ways of thinking about representation and self-definition, it makes sense in light of the moment that Rivers was writing, and as I've argued elsewhere, given the continuing lack of knowledge, I use that term rather than ignorance about Black peoples across the globe, including by some Black people in the US, which I lay at the doorstep of our overall still too ahistorical, incomplete, and Eurocentric educational system shaped as it is by racism, white supremacy, misogyny, classism, homophobia, and a host of other problems. Let me be clear, I do think there are a number of educators at every level who have worked and are currently working very hard to rectify this. Given this continuing lack of knowledge, in many ways, Rivers' call is still quite salient, unfulfilled, and necessary, even if we critique aspects of it or rethink and refashion it for today's world. We might also see Rivers' words and his delivery of them, especially in the context of tonight, as an act of intellectual, social, critical, and cultural resistance within his profession and the professoriate at large, calling for the training of more Black translators and for more works by and about Black people to be translated was and remains a profoundly political intervention. And its impact would have been immense in 1933 when the vast majority of Black American teachers at all levels taught at racially segregated institutions in the US, which is to say, at the legally segregated elementary and secondary schools my parents attended, and our historically Black colleges and universities, when the majority of Black American teachers at all levels were trained at HBCUs, and when the overwhelming majority of African American students, and we might add many undergraduates and graduates from across the Black diaspora, like Kwame Nkrumah, the first president of Ghana, and John Chilembwe, a pioneering figure in Malawi, were educated outside their home countries, if not at colonial institutions in the UK or France, at HBCUs. This is very interesting too. This is a moment where you have a number of these figures who are going to become, so important in the process of African liberation and independence, actually coming and studying at HBCUs in the United States. The transformative leverage of his appeal, if enacted, could have been truly transformative. Right? The leverage of his appeal, if enacted, could have been truly transformative. As it was, students did receive education in non-English languages, primarily classical and modern European languages at many, perhaps most HBCUs, and at many segregated public high schools in the US. So my parents at Sumner High School in St. Louis learned French, could take French and Spanish. As far as I know, education in indigenous African languages or in languages from other parts of the globe was relatively uncommon in segregated schools across the US, though someone probably has studied and written about this, and I would need to check this before I make any definitive statement. So there might be a graduate student out there who's thinking, what can I study? And this might be something to write about, right? The study of, non-European languages at HBCUs, right? The kind of history of that. What also is significant, I would argue, about Rivers' message was his anti-US nationalist, counter-hegemonic, and anti-colonialist and anti-imperialist aspects. I note this component of his work in general terms, but also believe it is important to restate at a moment of rising nationalism around the globe and in light of gathering tides like the ADOS movement, which is a movement that really, I think, gained steam last year. ADOS stands for American Descendants of Slaves. It's very sort of Black nationalistic in an interesting way in the US. Rivers was a diasporist shaped in part by the Pan-African movement and its call for cross-national and cross-linguistic, and as we know from the records of the gatherings, cross-racial in the sense of other non-white peoples being in attendance, solidarity, mutual support, and dialogue. And he recognized both that connecting with Black peoples and other oppressed and marginalized peoples across the globe was crucial for the Black struggle within the US and for anti-colonial and anti-imperialist struggles outside the US, but also that Black people in the US had a longer and richer history, a wider array of stories that were consonant with those, interlinked with those of Black people outside the US or non-English speaking ones within the US, as in the case of Puerto Rico. And that Blackness in the US then as now was not a zero-sum game as neoliberal global late capitalism shaped by and helping to foster and further white supremacy has led some of us, too many of us, to assume. Lastly, to underscore a point I previously stated, Rivers is critiquing the whiteness and Eurocentricity as well as the racist authority and discourse of and in his profession. I'm not going to engage in a critique of translation studies here, but suffice it to say that in the authoritative 2012 anthology, The Translation Studies Reader, which contains essays by many of the major contemporary theorists in the field, racism is cited only 3 times directly in the anthology. In fact, I verified, so I read this anthology and then, was taking notes, and I think I've got found 3 places. And so anyway, I checked the index, and it's only 3 times, and race is only discussed indirectly. So I'm going to mention the main place where that occurs. There is one figure in the text whose essay does follow in the spirit of Rivers' call, even as it explores other dimensions of the question of translation. Kwame Anthony Appiah's essay, Thick Translation, is the only essay by a Black scholar in that volume, and in it he appears to argue that, in fact, some of what Rivers pushed for has not only occurred, but that the anti-racist baseline is fundamental to some degree to the translation work being undertaken. I quote, "In the American Academy, the translation of African texts seems to me to be directed at least by such purposes as these: the urge to continue the repudiation of racism and sexism, the need to extend the American imagination beyond the narrow scope of the United States, the views of the world elsewhere that respect more deeply the autonomy of the other, views that are not generated solely by the legitimate but local political needs of America's multiple diasporas." He then adds, in Sapiens again, "To stress such purposes in translation is to argue that from the standpoint of an analysis of the current cultural situation, analysis that is frankly political, certain purposes are served by the literary, the text teaching institutions of the academy." And so he's making a case for, what it is that the academy can do, and what it does and what it can do, and that he links that to translation and to this anti-racist activism and struggle. Let me build on what he is saying, though, to assert that as I give this talk, the field itself, particularly in the US, both in terms of scholars, uh, theorists, and critics, and in terms of translators, is changing. And so I want to be very clear, because there are many people here who are doing this amazing work, and we could do a roll call of all of them who deserve praise for the work they're doing. Although there is a great deal still to be done, things are improving, and I want to leave you with that somewhat hopeful note. But let me stress, there is still a great deal to be done, again, both in terms of scholarly and critical work and in terms of translation itself. In an interview Veronica Esposito conducted with me last year, and it was actually roughly a year ago, with World Literature Today, I detailed to her some of the journals, organizations, and publishers, only some because there are many, and I apologize for leaving any out, who have undertaken the work I discuss here and myself have appealed for elsewhere. I did not mention individual translators, but there are so many superlative ones who are doing this work. And though I earlier suggested that this was an area for Black studies as a field specifically to continue to pursue, I want to be clear that translators of all backgrounds might take up this work, anti-racist work, anti-Black racist work, and these should be open to everyone. If I may end on a much more hopeful note, I'd like to cite the brilliant critic Kaguro Macharia, who wrote the following on his blog Without Predicate about the TV series Pose, in his attempts to imagine a parallel queer Nairobi of that era. Kaguro writes, "One ungenerous approach would be to claim that cultural products from one minoritized geohistory do not translate to another, and in that space of resentment, to demand representational fidelity rooted in cultural insiderism. I am uninterested in this. I find it narrow. I am interested instead in how minoritized groups seeking freedom across geohistories, across difference, might share imaginative spaces in the improvisatory call and response that transforms in the improvisatory call and response that transforms the call and response, the caller and the responders. Rather than complain about missing decades in Kenyan cultural production, I am overwhelmed by the shared space-time of Afro-diasporic and African abundance, delighted by the freedom work we create and share. I am inspired by the imaginations we share and feed, even when those imaginations center on grief and loss. Now, I want to call, and I hope you will respond. And I want you to call, and you hope I will respond. And we share this space time continuum and call it Blackness, call it diaspora, knowing something is always lost in the process just as much as something is born, transferred, and transformed with care and in struggle, leaving its traces as we see each other, as we read each other, as we speak each other and to each other, holding each other up gently and fiercely, daring to call this process translation. Thank you very much.
Oh my goodness. I'm going to make the clapping sound that should resound through this entire Zoom room. Thank you so much, John. That was so stunning. And what I want to say first is that I'm sure we have a room full here of a lot of folks who we admire very much. And I want to invite them to participate in this discussion in one of two ways. Either you can write your questions into the chat, or if you're less shy, do what Han is doing right now and raise your hand using the reactions button, and I'll invite you to unmute yourself. So with that, I'm going to give people like a minute to ruminate on this brilliant talk and formulate their thoughts, and ask, just one or two questions to get us going. I just found this so inspiring and challenging, John. And as a member of a Romance Languages and Literatures, department, one of the things that I was interested about River's vision was the way in which, these disciplines fall short of its capacities, and so this is a bit of a niche question, but it's not that often that I get to have conversations like this. So it's just clear to me that we need to reinvent academic disciplines altogether in order to accommodate this vision that, of course, as you point out, exposes that since antiquity, there has been contact that makes, even the divisions between black and white, but, the divisions between Europe and, Africa, that, confuses them very generatively, and that we would do well to remember. So I'm thinking of, not just like Pan-African Black studies, but also Mediterranean studies, and these different sorts of cross-national, cross-linguistic, cross-historical movements that still, however, tend to be about like certain types of subjects. And so I just wondered if you could expand upon what you see as the need to like reinvent, the university, and how we even study these things, the categories that we use, and how we start kind of like breaking through those walls so that, translation and Black studies are not seen as two different things, but like inextricably interwoven the way that you've just shown us. So maybe that as a first question.
That's such a, it's such a profound question and an important question. It's something I'm thinking about a lot. I'll say, I didn't say as much because I don't want to go on too long, but, I had written a paper, a short essay for a anthology called Teaching Black, basically explores what Black studies can teach creative writing. And one of the things that I was thinking about, with in that essay, when I was sort of trying to think about was, the relationship between Black studies when it began, right, and when it sort of entered institutions and the larger communities around it, right, and how, as a result of that history, Black studies, on the one hand, is all. I mean, I think it's the institutionalization of Africana studies, of Black studies, of African American studies. Um, is well along the way. I mean, it's for some places it's controversial, but in many institutions, particularly major, sort of the major institutions, it's not controversial at all, right? Um, but there is this tension, I think, that still exists in terms of the relationship between what scholarship looks like, what it does, who's doing it, right, and these communities that made this field in many ways possible, helped to institutionalize, right. It was in many cases Black students. I mean, there's a famous example at Harvard where the Black students demanded. I'm going to truncate this a little bit, but the Black students demanded Black studies, and there were several professors who my name was, who wanted to come up with a very kind of liberal, watered down version. These were white liberals, right? So they weren't completely opposed, but they didn't really want it to get, they wanted a department. And the Black students said, no, because we want to use all the tools of this institution, right, and the tools of academic, kind of academic study, research, etc., to do much more. We have to have a department. We have to basically institutionalize this, right? And so this dialectic, I feel like, in dialogue and dialectic has gone on for almost 50 years now. And I say all that to say that I think one of the challenges with the way that we understand disciplines is inertia. I'm thinking, for example, of there's been a lot of recent discussion of classics, and Daniel Padilla Peralta, who's at Princeton, has really, I mean, is one of several people who's, articulated a kind of new vision. I mean, should they even be classics? Should we even call it classics? I mean, what would that look like if, for example, as you mentioned, like Mediterranean studies, right? I mean, or Mediterranean North African studies, or how might you configure that in such a way that it really looked with as much complexity as possible about about that history, about those exchanges, right? And it's a challenge because if you think about the institutionalization of that field, there are many people who are just not, they're going to go kicking and screaming, they're not going to go, but if they do go, they'll be kicking and screaming, out the door, because it's like you're going to destroy something that we have spent, well, in the case of classics, hundreds of years, right, developing. Even though we can sort of date, if we look carefully at the history of classics, we can date kind of all the various processes that make this field help this field come into being, and the ideologies that are involved, etc. So, I mean, I think it's an important question. It's a challenging question, and part of what has to happen is, I think, people have to begin sort of trying to rethink their fields and disciplines. Now, one thing I'm just going to say is, someone made the good point. Well, if you rethink a discipline too much, you may, especially in this kind of moment, we're always in a moment of neoliberal austerity, right? You were thinking out of existence, right? If you say we don't need an English department, there are going to be these people who say, well, okay, yeah, we don't need an English department. We won't have anything doing this, right? We'll come up with some, I don't know, something. So I think that we have to be careful as we proceed, but I think it's an important question to important conversation to be having going forward, because of course, both in the United States and around the globe, I mean, things are not what they were, and I think the kind of thing we see, this kind of renewed nationalism cropping up in different ways in different places, and I think it's deeply, deeply disturbing. Right? It's deeply disturbing, and one way to counter that is through intellectual work, intellectual practice, and that the institutions like universities, college and universities, will play a very key role. So I probably didn't answer your question, but and spoke a lot. But.
No, you absolutely did. And thank you. I mean, yeah, I'm just thinking, I always think of the the like literal whitening of the classical statuary, the way that those were actually brilliantly colored, and they just came down to us with the paint and the jewels inlaid all off of them, and passed down this like sense of whiteness that is entirely out of touch with the reality. Um, but I just have like one other kind of counter question, which has to do with the difference between scholarship and translation.
Mhm.
And in the sense that the first question is really about what, as academics we can do, but
Mhm.
it seems like that there really is this autodidactic impulse in translation that can live in translation. And I just wondered if you had thoughts about like the difference between translating, which is sometimes done by folks who are entirely outside of, academic like tenure lines and things. And interpretation is an important aspect of translation that we've thought about, and that I know you've thought about as well, in listening to and experiencing the performances and talks of Antena Aire. So yeah, like what difference does it make to translate, rather than studying from through academic frameworks,
Mhm.
um, African descended authors of the Black diaspora, or African authors? Yeah, because you do everything. So you're kind of switching modalities, and as someone that switches modalities, also I'm really interested in the answer to this question.
Well, so let me just be clear that outside of academia, right? Translators are absolutely invaluable. I mean, I will just say that I was thinking about I mean, many times I've had this conversation with, Jennifer Hofer, right? Who's an amazing translator. And, she was saying, she reminds me, look, okay, if you're translating in a courtroom, right, it can be a matter of, you know, a person's life, in prison or out, right? In the carceral state we live in. I mean, translation in a very sort of practical, everyday sense is absolutely crucial. We think about, translation for, and in the medical field, translation in criminal justice, right, and on and so forth. So I think that translation and thinking about translation and encouraging translation, just broadly understood, is very, very, very important, right? Um, and it exists outside, but I also want to say that I feel like academia can play a role. So one of the things that one of the little programs that I was involved with, and I haven't been as involved with it. I mean, I helped to co-found it, and then of course an amazing colleague of mine, Jennifer Austin, really has been running it. It's called Lives in Translation, and one of the things that we had discussed, because we were thinking, okay, translation, particularly at a campus like Rutgers Newark, is just kind of would be something we should really be fundamentally thinking about. We have such a diverse student population. Students and their families come from all over the globe. And we should draw upon those resources, encourage them, right? This is like I've said this before, so forgive me if for repeating it, but it's like, being able to speak another language is a superpower, right? Often it's looked up, for many people as something that's kind of shameful, but it's like an incredible gift to have this other language in your head and to be able to use it and to communicate with other people. So, how do you build upon that? So, Lives in Translation has developed some really interesting programs, and students are interns, in different areas. Um, and I just think, and then, of course, other universities are doing this. So there's a way in which, in terms of the university and in terms of translation and all these other possibilities, there is a kind of important connect. But it's also linked to the community, right? So we come back to this question of the larger communities, right, that are out there. So that's something I try to think about too. I mean, I think when I was writing translating poetry, translating Blackness, I was thinking specifically about literary translation and cultural products. And part of what I was trying to think about was this question, and I'm, of course, I'm not the first person to bring this up, this question of a kind of African-American hegemony, right? There's a link to Americanness and the circulation of Blackness around the globe, right? I mean, I remember many years ago, I was in a conversation with, I did an interview with he's now the head of Grupo Gator Bahia, Marcelo Cerqueira, and he was talking about all of these American TV shows and things that showed or on down in Brazil, and I was like, what? I was like, no, you don't want this garbage, please, no. But I mean, it's like you go now. Of course, it's much easier with social media. This was right before social media, but now you got social media. I mean, young people all over the world are listening to Beyonce and Rihanna, and I mean, it's like this has always been happening, the circulation, but it's incredibly powerful. And I think sometimes what I was trying to get us to do is to step back and think about this a bit more, right? And think about this being a kind of it's not a even dialogue, or in terms of the relationship, not there's a hierarchy here, and so to think about one's own implication in this hierarchy and how these cultural products travel, right? And not just literature, but of course music, etc. So anyway, so I'll stop there, but great question.
Thank you so much. Yeah, and I think there, or maybe in an elsewhere, you also talk about the way that certain figures are discussed as though they were Brazilian, i.e., white, when they're actually African descended people. And so there are just so many different riddlings of the historical record that we need to continue to push for. So we've got 4 hands so far. So I'm just going to go arbitrarily in the order in which they appear on my screen. So I'm going to ask Sophia Azeb to ask a question.
Thank you, Jennifer. And thank you, Prof. Keen. That was a wonderful talk, and I really appreciate it. First, I'm just going to recommend to you that you check out a magazine called Lotus Afro-Asian Writings, which facilitated literary translation across the Third World during the anti-colonial era, solely for those who were part of the tricontinental world. But that is directly related to my question, I promise. So it's really wonderful to consider your talk today in the context of a university that has never had a Black Studies department, nor any autonomous ethnic studies department, and where those of us here who work in Black Studies are presumed to work in English or on the US, and where the boundaries of global Blackness are understood solely through Euro-American cartographies that exclude Black Americans anyway. So your talk is also especially resonant in the midst of an ongoing diversity work stoppage by many UChicago faculty affiliates of the Center for the Study of Race, Politics, and Culture. And I'll admit that I'm among those faculty who are engaged in this work stoppage. In light of that, I think I'd really love to ask if you might ruminate, and I know you said you didn't want to talk about this, so you don't have to. I'm going to give you an option. I'd love to hear, I'd love to ask if you might ruminate on the inverse of what your reading of Rivers opens up for us in terms of mediating on the centrality of translation for fully mapping the contours of Blackness in the Black diaspora, but also what translation studies might attend to vis-a-vis that diaspora. Or, put another way, the constancy of Black translational practice is a history that you have helpfully illuminated. But can we also imagine a standard of translational ethics? Or, and this is the option, you're way out of that if you want, should we just translate entirely for and with one another? And what would that entail?
Oh my God, well, there's so much there. Well, first of all, I stand with you in your work stoppage. I think for so many of us who are at institutions that have departments of Black studies or Africana studies, one of the things I always want to pay tribute to is the bravery, the courage, the vision of the people who made that possible. In the case of Rutgers Newark and Rutgers, broadly understood, it was our students, right? They faced down, a group of people outside, I believe the mayor, the cops, right? Yeah. And they negotiated with the then president of the university, but it was a very, very ugly scene, right? Their lives were in danger, right? Um, they literally put their lives on the line to make it possible. And so, I mean, I think that's, as I was saying earlier, it's kind of written into the DNA of the field. Um, I mean, again, you raised so many points. I'm not even sure where to start, but I guess I would say that yes. I mean, one of the things to to pick up on your final point or your final kind of gambit is that yes, we should translate for and with each other. I mean, we should think about translation in the broadest and most open senses, and to think about I mean, I guess I was more focused in this paper on anti-racist practice, but of course, I mean, I think translation opens up the possibility of dialogues, conversations, right, collaborations on a range of themes and topics, right, that is, that are intersectional, right, and that may open up spaces that we have not even yet imagined when we think about, right, the kinds of work we can do together, right, the kinds of practices we can imagine and undertake together. So yes, I mean, I would say in the richest and broadest sense of the idea of translation, we should you know we should proceed. And I see one of the people who has her hand raised, and I hope I get to speak with her, is Marla Kaza, but she has an amazing essay on and she edited an amazing anthology, a little anthology in a journal, but on translation as a kind of practice of hospitality. But it's very beautifully and complexly argued. And it's something I return to again and again. In fact, actually, in an early version of this paper, when I had embedded translations I'd done and snippets of what other people had to say about translation, I had a snippet of Madhu's what she'd written, her part of one of her paragraphs in there as a kind of resonant node to kind of keep me thinking and dreaming about what translation might do. So I didn't answer your question. It was just such an amazing question. So our series of questions. So, but I hope I touched upon something that related to what you were talking about. And I wish you the very best. I wish you the very best.
Thanks, John. So I think it's a great time to call on Madhu to ask a question.
Hi, everyone. Hi, John. This was really wonderful to hear this version of this talk. Really have so many thoughts, and you actually kind of already answered my question. But I guess I wanted to just mention them, just like more a comment. So earlier today, I had the opportunity to listen to Fred Wilson give a talk with his work, and he was talking about his work in Turkey and how he encountered Black people in Turkey, and at first believed that they were kind of recent immigrants, and then realized no, they've been in Turkey for hundreds of years as part of earlier slave trade, and encounters with Afro-Kurds and Afro-Armenians, and just talking about Blackness in all these other contexts that we don't in the US, I think, often think about. And it just, so when you were talking earlier about like classics, I just was thinking like, what would it mean for when you do Middle Eastern studies or Turkish studies or Greek studies to really have Black studies kind of be part of that conversation. And I think then vice versa, like inversely, I guess the thing I want to say is also then what I love about translating poetry, translating Blackness is I work with predominantly Black and Brown students. And so and many of whom are very, have a kind of African-American nationalist kind of approach to Blackness. They are, their idea of Blackness is African-American. And so I think that piece really kind of unsettles them and having to think about how do we expand, so I guess I just wanted to say like, I really appreciate the way that you're talking about different disciplines and discourses, and also that it's, I guess, like each discipline changes. And so Black studies, like, I think when we're working with African American students, sometimes it's like, really talking about how Blackness is a concept that changes over time and geographically. And then also just, so I guess that's really, I think you've already covered it, but I just wanted to say thanks for this. And it's been very, it's been very stimulating. Thanks.
Thank you, and thank you for your work. And I just wanted to follow up on this. I want to be clear that on the one hand, I understand and I honor, the particular distinctive experiences of Black people in the United States, of African Americans, right? I am African American, right? So I do not want to erase that long and complex history, but I also want to kind of emphasize is that history is complex. It is very complex, and we think about. I mean, you go to. I was on a panel earlier talking about the archive, and I'm working on a book now, one of the new projects, and I was in the archive and I was looking at the Boston. I've said this to people before, so if people have heard it, forgive me, but I'm looking at the Boston town records, like the city of Boston, and it's like 1790s, I believe. And one of the people on the it was like, I don't know what it was, not Boston City Council, but whatever the sort of predecessor was, who has this incredibly Baroque name, Shujaisa Born, right? So Shujaisa Born enters into the records that he is concerned about the city of Boston, because he says there are just so many Negroes from the southern states. And I'm thinking, okay, how are people getting from the southern states? And also from the Caribbean, right? In 1790s, right? That he's concerned that there is this influx of Black people, right? That it's such that he has to basically put it on the record, right? And this is in the archive, right? So it's just it's one of those things that I had no idea that this was there. And as it turns out, shortly around that time, there was, I believe, a forced dispossession of Black people who were not born in Boston. So if you were not born in Boston, to confirm it, they drove you out of the city. I mean, so this is a history that never gets talked about. That's erased, right? And it's repeated and repeated and repeated. So in the sense that I always want to be attentive to the uniqueness and particularity of African American experience, broadly understood, richly understood. That's important. At the same time, I think that one of the things that I also honor is that so many people who came before me and us were very aware of whatever their limitations in terms of how they've been trained or raised, et cetera, about this larger Black world, and not just Black in very complex ways of thinking about that term, but then also the other minoritized people, right? Other minoritized experiences and geohistories and so forth, right? And how that the struggle was something. The struggles that were taking place were local, but also global, right? You see this happening right now. I mean, I think so. I want to, I think you're making an excellent point, and it can be startling for students to think about, that there are. I mean, for example, in all of the discussions that were happening last summer in the United States around the state murders by police of African Americans, these parallels, they're parallels that are happening elsewhere. They're happening in Canada, they're happening in Britain, especially happening in Brazil. And I was thinking to myself, what would happen if we had a clear sense that this was a global problem, right? This is not just localized, not to erase what's happening in the U.S., because it's extremely important. And as we saw, once the Black Lives Matter protests began in the U.S., right, they were replicated all over, to the point that in a place like Australia, the marchers were threatened, right? And they said, we don't want this, right? We don't want this foreign thing coming here. But also, I think there was a really sort of powerful recognition that once people, start sort of thinking through these ideas and saying, look what's happened in this country with its history, right? They're going to be making all kinds of demands for not that they had been making them, but that, it's going to accelerate demands for change, and preparations, all kinds of things. So, I just want to, in a sense, kind of to think about that back and forth always being in place, and that itself is a form of translation, but with a certain amount of humility, and also, as you so beautifully point out, hospitality, right, in terms of how we relate to each other, how we speak to each other, how we hear or don't hear each other, but we strive to hear each other. So thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And of course, part of the difficulty when, for instance, Black Lives Matter really took off in Italy. People in the US don't know that because it's not exactly what gets reported about what's happening in Italy. The little that gets reported, on Italian news is not going to be, that there are protests and that there are monuments that are, there are demands that these colonial monuments be taken down. So there's just so much work to do in order for that solidarity to be achieved. Okay, so we have Nama, Han, and then JD. So hopefully we can have these last three questions. So I'm going to call on Nama.
Thank you, Jen. And thank you, John, for a wonderful talk. I'll try to make it brief. And my question really follows up on Sophia's question directly, and it does also register the fact that your talk resonates, especially right now here on this campus, as far as we are here on this campus, in relation to the sort of the intellectual energy that is produced by the work that Sophia and others are pursuing through this campaign. I guess I'm curious if you would say more about sort of what it means to recover the work of someone like Napoleon Rivers, and when and how sort of either kind of within critical university studies or also within kind of struggles to change the university, when and how we build on sort of pasts within academia and within the university. And that struck me as something that I haven't seen so much in discussions of critical university studies, as sort of an excavation of something within the academy itself that maybe has been forgotten or hasn't kind of had a full, the lines of kind of succession from it haven't been fully recognized. So I was just curious if you would say more about what that turn to history within the university means in relation to these discussions.
I mean, I think that's an excellent point. These have been excellent questions and points. I mean, I guess what I would say is that, so I don't want to erase the work that is being done and has been done, right, within particular fields and disciplines, right? And then to think in terms of individual institutions, and to think, I mean, I've cited this book many times, Craig Stephen Wilder's Ebony and Ivy, which looks at slavery and the American university. And then of course I think about, people who are looking at, the history of racism in medicine, the history of racism in, as we're saying, in the classics, and but I guess, so maybe what we need is to think about how we, in various ways, at various points, people can come together and share this knowledge and sort of think about articulating a kind of larger vision that, to sort of think about how fields have come into being, disciplines have come into being, institutions have come into being, and kind of use that as the foundation for rethinking, rebuilding, coming up with new ways of thinking about, how to go forward. So, which is, I feel like I'm talking around your great question. I mean, again, because I think there's been some amazing work that's been done, and with someone like Rivers, I mean, the material was was sitting there. I mean, but again, on the other hand, I mean, I have not spent a huge amount of time looking into, for example, if there are archives of Rivers. But I'm sure if I went and looked in the archives and spent some time doing that, I would find like all kinds of interesting things that would then suggest just, kind of new directions to go in terms of thinking about the work he was doing at this particular period and, sort of his trajectory and then moving forward. Because, I just thought it was so fascinating that, he goes and gives this paper and then, he's quite aware, okay, Du Bois is someone that I want to work with and I want to put myself at the service of this project that he's doing because, I'm going to do the work I'm going to do, but Du Bois's work is going to have this, have a much greater footprint, right? As we know, as it did, right? And that footprint continues to resonate. But Rivers call, even though it's not so well known, also contributes because as Rosa Alcala suggested to me, you're in conversation with him, whether you know it or not, right? And that I think is really kind of important. So that's something I think we can also think about is as we're recovering some of these figures to think about, critically, what kinds of conversations we are really in with them and how we can think about that to move forward.
Nama, did you want to, is your hand still up or you're good? Okay. That idea that we're still in conversation with people even when we don't know, I think is essential. So I'm going to call on Han, the co-architect of this series, and give the last word to JD because JD was unable to be there in the digits when we had Antena Aire and Damiche a couple of weeks ago. So Han.
Yeah. Okay. I was just wondering if we might not tighten the focus up a little bit and talk about specifically the relation of Black people in America to the French language. There's a beautiful book by Sarah Johnston called The Fear of French Negroes, which is about the aftermath, the century after the Haitian Revolution, during most of which Haiti was treated as a pariah state. No one traded with them. There were no diplomatic relations. There was even a speech in Congress about the unadvisability of so doing for, I think I'm more or less quoting accurately, the safety and security of a great part of our republic would be endangered if Haitian diplomats were to come to Washington and be treated like human beings. So there's actually a great fear that Black people will learn to speak French, be in contact with Haiti. Black people in New Orleans could inherit, own property, follow many professions, in ways that were impossible elsewhere. So the French language really has a very special place here. And in that goes a particular kind of French cosmopolitanism. I'm not saying that the French are not racist. They are differently racist from most English speakers. They have their own hangups, but it was possible, for example, for Anténor Firmin, whom you mentioned, and of whom I'm a huge fan, to write a book-length rebuttal of Gobineau, right, on the equality of human races in 1885. And it's a book that, because it was a valuable book, was taken up and debated rather than just being, burned or forgotten or suppressed or whatnot. So French in France opened up some possibilities to Black people from the Americas that would otherwise be closed off to them. And in fact, returning soldiers from World War I, were treated with extraordinary brutality in places like Tulsa because they had been abroad and spoken that other language and been perceived otherwise. So anyway, there's a fascinating story here about this cosmopolitanism, which, like all cosmopolitanisms, can fall into hypocrisy and triviality, but which I see still alive in some ways as an aspiration in the work of Alain Maboncou, for example, whom you've translated and who is an admirable writer. But this strain of cosmopolitanism also has come up under a lot of critique, also by the negritude writers of the early 20th century. So anyway, I'm thinking about this very complicated relationship between an ideal and its execution, and yet the way that that ideal can still represent something for people who aren't allowed membership in it in another place. I don't know if you want to elaborate on the specificity of Frenchness meeting Blackness for Americans.
Well, that's a huge topic. I mean, I would say, first of all, France was one of the major colonial powers, and its brutality all over the globe should not be downplayed, right? I think you read any accounts of the sugar plantations in Haiti, or France's depredations in continental Africa, or in South Asia, etc. And we can see that whatever the jeu d'esprit might have been about the cosmopolitan, when it came down to just everyday practice, France could be as brutal as anyone else, right?
Sure.
So I think it's a fascinating topic. I will say that in addition to the places that you mentioned, I mentioned sort of one of the quotations I have in my very first book, Annotations, by someone writing about the history of my native city, St. Louis. Makes the point that the people everywhere, the people spoke French. And the woman actually says they spoke French to each other, they spoke French to their horses, and they spoke French to their Negroes. So, right, there was not a lot of cosmopolitanism there. I think there is a question, though, we could say, of a certain kind of ideal that has remained more ideal than reality. I think someone's pointed out to me many years ago, the French, had less of a problem. Let's say no problem, but had less of a problem with the African American troops. So there were some problems, or writers and amazing performers like Josephine Baker coming. But when it came to their own Black people, it was a very different story, right? And I think that's the case today. I just remember in the early 2000s. Just jumping back a few years, when he had not yet become president, I believe, Nicolas Sarkozy basically was talking about the banlieue and the Black and brown young people, and used that horrific term, basically, use fire hoses against them, and of course there was a lot of pushback. But one of the things I found really interesting was, even at this moment, to think about translation, there were a number of works by young Black and brown French people that were written contemporaneously with that moment, and right after that, right? Some of these really extraordinary authors, and a great deal of that work has never been translated, right? It has never come into English, right? And I think, how might our perspective change or have changed if we were hearing from those voices, which isn't to say the journalists didn't seek them out, et cetera. But I think, it's like a more complex, portrait of France and, its relationship to, as I said, its own Black people, and Black people, in this country and across the globe, might open up to us. And we'll just mention, I think it's very fascinating that someone like Alain Maboncou, who writes in French, is a professor here. As awful as the United States can be. I think he has an opportunity to do things here that would be, I think, a challenge, perhaps in France, right? There is I think we think about the Black French voices are elevated. And I, not say this not as a criticism of any Black French writers, right? But I think, just think about who gets elevated in French literary culture. And of course, there's still a serious problem. If you look at, there's been discussion of this with prizes and publications, et cetera. But who gets elevated and who is not really, kind of discussed or talked about even in France. So I think it's a fascinating question, and that relationship is a very special one. And I would even say, alongside, France and of course Haiti, and of course Creole comes into the picture. I think, the relationship of Black people in this country and in this hemisphere in Spanish, is worthy of a sense of discussion too. There's fascinating kind of series of, I guess, discussions you could have on that topic. So probably didn't answer your question, but I'm glad that you asked it.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. So, as I mentioned, JD was suffered the consequences of the strategic infrastructural failures in Texas a couple of weeks ago and wasn't able to be present in our colloquium. So I am so delighted that they're here now. And I want to offer you the chance to ask the last question. JD, thanks for coming.
Yeah, thank you so much. I'm so sad I wasn't able to make it, and I'm very happy that my power is on again. The Republicans haven't managed to take it away from us permanently yet. But in any case, I wanted to ask a quick question. I'm part of the editorial committee with Jen, Eliana Hofer, and Antena Aire for Señal, a series of Latin American poetry and translation, a series of chapbooks. And as part of that, we've been working over the last years to do more Afro-diasporic translations. We published Urayoa Noel's translation of Winston Gonzalez. Just this year, Monchuachi, a French Creole writer, translated by Patricia Hartland. And I mean, even the inclusion of a Creole writer in a Latin American series is trying to do some work about troubling what Latin America might mean. But I guess the question that beyond that is really about, I thought you were really generous to kind of say that this task of Afro-diasporic translation is a task for everyone. But at the same time, I also think there's specific limitations that happen when white translators are working on Afro-diasporic texts. And I wanted to kind of ask you to talk about that a little bit. Because I think, especially when you're dealing with Afro-diasporic languaging, whether it's in Spanish or in Creole, bringing that into English is a very specific task. And so what happens in that process, I think sometimes when white translators do it, it can either lead to an erasure or an appropriation or minstrelsy even. It can become odd and troublesome. And so I wanted to kind of mention that because I've seen it happening out in the world with a kind of well-intentioned white translators rushing to translate more Afro-diasporic literature. And I want to kind of trouble that a little bit and think about how efforts are also being made to support Afro-diasporic translators working into English. So just to kind of bring up that question and see whatever thoughts come out for you. Thank you.
No, I mean, I think that's an excellent point. And I mean, when I'm saying everyone, because I'm thinking about, just some of the people who are doing this work, and a number of these translators are white translators, and they're doing very, very good work. At the same time, in translating poetry, translating Blackness, I specifically called for more Black translators, and not just to say, translate, just become translator, but right, mentoring, encouragement, work collaborations, right, so that Black translators and other translators of color have the opportunity to do this work, right? Because it starts with a translator, but of course, or sometimes with a publisher, but then of course you have the whole question of the publishing world and the literary world at large and academia, et cetera, and who has access and who doesn't, right? So I think that's important. I mean, I think it's, it's tough because some translators really, really are very culturally sensitive, very aware. They're always trying to learn. They're humble when it comes to what it is they're doing. And I mean, I think even people who do, and this could be true of a Black translator as well, or translator of any race, who, accepts all of those. I mean, basically, proceeds from all of those premises, still can flub things, badly, because of course there's not. I mean, if you're not, you may think you understand something, but you don't. I mean, I always give the example of, this was many, many years ago. One of the first writers I ever translated was the Brazilian writer Edmilson de Almeida Pereira from Juiz de Fora, Minas Gerais. And, I was really excited. He was very kind and let me, translate his work. And I made the assumption, thinking, am I reading about him, but it made the assumption that, he was referring to one Brazilian religious tradition. And as it turns out, it was completely wrong. And he was very kind. And he said, no, I mean, that's not right. Sometimes you need to hear that. That's not right. I'm from Minas Gerais, and my tradition is this other one, right? So this is what, and then he pointed me in the direction of places to look and read. And I mean, it was absolutely enlightening, right? And as it turns out, he's written about this and stuff, but again, he was so modest. He wasn't going to say, look, guy, I'm really one of the authorities on this in Brazil. You should know this. I mean, he was, but so I mean, I stepped back with humility and said, I mean, this is something I need to learn, right? And I think this sometimes happens. It often happens, where we kind of realize, okay, we reach the limits of what we know and we have to do more work. I mean, the other thing I'll say is, I was looking over a translation by a very talented translator, and there was an instance of vernacular. I won't say which language, but there was an instance of vernacular in this other language. And immediately in my mind, I had an idea of what it might look like in English, because the spirit of what the poet was saying struck me as not unlike what I hear people saying all the time, right? People I grew up with, right? Even though completely different countries, everything. So I was asked to look at this over, and I made a suggestion, and the translator said, oh, okay, let me do it, and kind of tinkered with it a little bit. And, it was not exactly, I thought there was still a problem, right? And so I kind of gently pointed it out, and the person made a few more changes. And then, I said, well, this is not my translation, right? So and I'm not the publisher either. So, and if the poet thinks it's okay, that's fine. But, I think just immediately upon looking at that section of this book, I saw what it might be. Now, there have been other times where I've looked at things and I've been utterly baffled, and there are people who can just kind of step in and say, oh, this is what this is, and blah, 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 blah. So, I think it's cultural sensitivity, attentiveness, rigor, a desire to, as I said, be humble, to challenge oneself and one's sense of, what one knows. These are all very important things. And I say that as a way of saying that, I do encourage everyone to take up the task for translation. And I just want to, praise the work that you all are doing, because I think it's amazing, right? But I think you'd probably attest to this, that there, in as much as you do know, there are still these moments where you say, you know what, I don't know. And so I'm going to actually, of course, the author is living, I'm going to talk to that author and try to puzzle through with them what it is they're trying to say. And then how can I bring that into English, right, or another language? So, but thank you for that excellent comment.
Thank you, JD, and thank you, John. I think this is a fantastic way to end the series, on a call for more humility, for more collective action, for a transformation of the university, for support for Black Studies at the University of Chicago and everywhere. And, just more study, more care, and less attention to, the hyperactive rhythms of the market with its very specific, calls, and the idea that we just have to be tripping over ourselves and over the texts in order to publish, when in fact, this work that you're calling us to do requires focus, concentration, and above all, care and time.
Mm-hmm.
So I'm just really honored that you joined us, and that.
Thank you so much, you and everyone. Thank you so much.
And yeah, the audience has been wonderful for the whole series. Thank you all for coming out. Thank you for staying. Thank you for watching us in the Zoom room and on YouTube today and in the future. and go out and do the work.
Yes, 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 yes.
Thank you. Have a
Thank
great
you.
evening, everyone. Stay safe and healthy.